Welcome to this session on managing microaggressions. I'm Megan Anderson, and I'm very excited to be with you for this next hour as we explore the concept of microaggressions and the impact they have on inclusivity within the workplace. So during this session, I'm going to invite you, please, to use the chat. Love to hear from you during the session, so make sure that's activated, because I'm going to start with a question, and that is, what is a microaggression? So I'd love you to type into the chat, what is your understanding so far of microaggressions? So I'm going to wait a few moments just while I hear some of your comments and thoughts as they come in. So hopefully your fingers are ready. So here they come. So exactly, snide remarks, a very small gesture that will instigate aggravation in others. Invisible but existing aggressions, a minor outburst. Some amazing descriptions, a biased negative comment, not always intended, and that's a really important aspect. So as we can see, microaggressions are commonplace terms that are daily verbal, behavioral, environmental slights. They can be intentional or unintentional, and they communicate hostility and negative attitudes. And as mentioned in one of the comments, often they are unintentional. So microaggressions are actually really tricky to manage because of this. And that's what we're going to be exploring in this session. So let's begin by really touching base with, why do you think we need to deal with microaggressions? These slights, these things that make us feel uncomfortable, the unintentional, many times, insults. Why is it so important? And why have so many of you joined this session today? So once again, please do go ahead and enter into the chat. Why is dealing with microaggressions so very important? So let's get some of your thoughts. So good question. Deal with as aggressor or aggressed, both, I would say. What is the impact of microaggressions might be another way of looking at it. And as we know, there's two parties involved. There's those who are on the receiving end of a microaggression and those who might be instigating the microaggression. So we can see that they have an impact on having a harmonious relationship. They can get in the way of mutual understanding, prevent people from feeling as if they belong. It leaves me all day long with an intangible bad feeling. And that's just a really great way of summing up this tremendous impact that can result from a microaggression. They can fester and really impact relationships in the long term. And they ruin inclusion and trust and psychological safety. So I think it goes without even questioning that dealing with microaggressions is absolutely essential if we want to create a really inclusive environment. And we're going to begin with really touching base with a little bit more background on what do we mean by microaggressions and some examples of them. So I'm just going to play you a short video, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about that. So I'm going to stop sharing there.
In this short video, we're going to have a look at microaggressions to understand what they are, why it's important we talk about them, and how we can address the inequity experienced by some people in the workplace. In talking about microaggressions, we are not going to talk about those times when people are deliberately rude or actively exclude others. This affects a very small number of people, and this video isn't going to change their minds. When we talk about microaggressions, we're talking about the careless, unthinking things that we do or say that reinforce a social distance and effectively say to someone, you don't really belong here, or you're too different to ever fit in properly. They are often unintentional, accidental, or unnoticed by the person acting them out, but the cumulative impact on marginalized individuals can be huge. The question to consider is how we can be curious and engaged about our colleagues and their backgrounds whilst also being highly respectful. Pia, an Emirati woman living in France, explained that she had given up her passion for horse riding due to microaggressions. She was a member of a riding club outside Paris. When the terrorist bombs went off in 2015, several of her friends at the club texted her, telling her not to worry. They knew that she was one of the nice Muslims. Pia understood that her friends were trying to reassure her, but carelessly they had emphasized her otherness and stereotyped her religion as well. Sonja works in Houston and is constantly asked where she's from. She always replies that she's from Houston. She was born in Houston, as were her parents. Frequently, people ask her, but where are you from originally? Sonja's grandparents and her mother's side are Mexican, and on her father's side are Black American, so people assume she's from an immigrant family and even compliment her on her excellent English. Raj is always asked to explain the rules of cricket. Natasha is asked if her parents were in the KGB. Sunli is always complimented on her math skills. George is always asked if he's tried going on a diet and doing more exercise. Microaggressions emphasize a difference. They reduce a person to the one thing that the speaker identifies them with. Raj is Indian and nothing more. Natasha's Russian, Sunli is Chinese, George is overweight. The microaggressions portray an individual as a caricature and strip them of their individuality. Microaggressions are symptoms of intellectual and social laziness. We don't bother to treat a person as they deserve, but we impose our interpretation of their identity on them and accuse them of being oversensitive when they react. Prevention is better than the cure. But if you do realize that you have upset someone, apologize honestly and openly. Don't excuse yourself, and most importantly, ensure you don't repeat the mistake. You may not be forgiven, but it is essential that you acknowledge your fault. Here are some suggestions to reduce the frequency of microaggressions. Firstly, build up your empathy and cultural intelligence. Empathetic self-awareness will help you respect other people's individuality. Cultural intelligence will help you include and build cohesion. Secondly, call other people out on their microaggressions. Do it sensitively and not in public. Equity and fairness can only be achieved when we become active bystanders who do not accept inequity. Thirdly, educate yourself. Don't expect others to constantly point out what you should do. It's your responsibility. And finally, actively look for behaviors that include others and break down barriers and difference. Even radical immediate change will be met with caution by marginalized individuals. Being on the receiving end of constant microaggression has been shown to cause chronic mental health issues, so it is a hugely important issue both at work and out of work, and one we must treat with extreme sensitivity. The responsibility is on all of us to change our behaviors and attitudes, respecting others as individuals, valuing them as equal partners, and standing up for inequity are the real marks of inclusive people and organizations. And it takes courage and determination to see it through.
So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts or key takeaways from that video. So do go ahead and enter those into chat, because there's one of the questions I'd love to explore from that video. And that is that very first example that we had about Pia and the fact that receiving that microaggression actually impacted her desire to continue on with her hobby. So what was the intention of what was said to Pia? The assurance that she was one of the nice Muslims. What was the intention? And how did that differ from the actual impact? And I think that's just one of the really interesting aspects of this, is that often there's such a disconnect between the two. So I'm just, really noticing what happened. So a clumsy way of trying to make her feel okay. So the intention was to try and make her feel okay. And the word clumsy is a really great description of the impact. And so often what we notice with microaggressions is that disconnect between the intention, which was a positive intention, and the negative impact. Why do you think that would have hurt her so much that she decided to quit horse riding? Why do you think that had that kind of impact? Because I think this really goes to the heart of the implication. So it highlighted her difference. It highlighted her difference in a way that she might have been unaware of, that even existed between her and her peer group. So suddenly having that difference highlighted in that way creates this sense of otherness that can be so eroding of one's sense of confidence and connection, feeling of ease. Very, very wide and broad impact, and shows that she is seen as an other when she might have not ever considered herself in that way. So as we explore further this concept of microaggressions, we're going to be really looking at the fact that there are a number of different types of microaggressions. And I'm going to walk through each of those just to give you a sense of what we mean by them and what the differences between them are. So microassaults are deliberate and intentional slights or insults that are meant to hurt the intended victim through things like name calling, avoidant behavior, and purposeful discriminatory actions. Microassaults can also include things like moving your purse or bag when you're around certain people, changing seats on a bus because of somebody perhaps sitting next to you, casting blame or accusing someone because of their profile, making excuses for discriminatory language or comments, and then claiming it was a joke. Those are some examples of how microassaults might show up. Microinvalidation is the dismissing or downplaying of someone's experience and their experience of things like hurt or anger or discriminatory behavior. It attempts to put the blame or the anger or the shame on the victim rather than the person who is the instigator. And it can also be denying the value of the person's experience because of their background or profile. So an example of this might be, you can't possibly have an opinion because you're just too young, or you're new around here, or too inexperienced, or you will never understand what we mean because you haven't experienced that. So little ways in which we might invalidate the opinion, the perspective, the value that someone might be wanting to add in a situation. Micro insults are rude, insensitive comments that subtly disrespect a person's identity. This could be assuming that someone isn't smart based on their appearance, or implying that certain groups or people don't have morals. They might even be used to suggest that someone doesn't belong. So examples of this might be things like assuming someone won't understand a new process at work because their English isn't their first language, or saying someone is not from a marginalized group because they don't act stereotypically. It can be also expressed as a veiled compliment. And I think this is a really tricky one. So, for example, you speak excellent German for a Brit, or you're very intelligent for someone who's so young, or when people express surprise because you're not acting in a stereotypical way. And so these are all different kinds of microaggressions. And I think what's really interesting is to look at how these might show up in a scenario. And we're going to be exploring this scenario. And I'll just briefly run through some of these points in case it's showing up quite small for you. And as I do that, what I would love you to do is pop into the chat examples of microaggressions. Don't worry so much about which type of microaggression. Just where do you see things potentially being problematic in this scenario? So we've got Maria, who's just come back from maternity leave, and Mark, who invites her to a meeting at 5 p.m. to go over what she's missed. He's her new manager, and he's never met her before. When she comes in, he immediately says, "Oh, you're not what I expected at all. Surely you're far too young to be a mother." And as Maria frowns, he continues and says, "Oh, just joking." They engage in small talk for a while, and Mark says, "Your English is really good. Where did you learn it?" Maria replies that her parents taught her, to which Mark responds, "They must be really good teachers. Where are you from originally?" One of the examples we saw in the video. When they eventually talk about work, Mark says, "Well, as a new mother, we must make sure we don't overstress you. I'll just give you the small clients to look after for now." Eventually, Maria says she has to go home and leaves to make a decision about whether to change job or not. So here we see a conversation, and I'd love you to point out what you are noticing that's problematic. So let's see, we've got lots already coming in. Meeting at 5 p.m. Not exactly friendly in terms of needing to get back, especially as a new parent. Some are not just microaggressions, just aggressions. That's another really good point. When they say your English is really good, that sense of otherness. So we're even having some people in the chat saying that these are things that they've actually experienced as well. Making the assumption that she's not able to handle big clients, that somehow her capacity is reduced and he's needing to downsize and manage her role. Comments about her being a young mother and her appearance and you know, stereotypically mentioning that. So making assumptions about her performance, her ability to perform. So it's totally understandable why Maria would be questioning whether this was going to be a future good fit for her work-wise. So we see numerous examples there. So thank you for putting that in, and including the one about joking, because I think humor, or the attempt at using humor, often backfires in the context, particularly when we can't be sure how that might be taken, and it could be misinterpreted. And in this case, used as a way of accommodating or addressing what's clearly not landed well for Maria. So this raises a number of questions, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. Is it okay to ask someone where they're from? If we're talking about it, perhaps creating a sense of otherness, is it okay to compliment someone? We saw an example of a veiled compliment in the previous slide. Is it okay to tell jokes? We know that humor sometimes can be a little bit tricky. Is it okay to ask about someone's home life or personal life? Is it also okay to make adjustments based on their work situation? What are your thoughts on this? One of the reasons why I think this is a very important conversation is that this is something that we need to navigate every day. And it's often the case that we don't have absolute yes or no to any of these questions. So what are your thoughts on this? It depends on the situation of the conversation. Yes, but you have to have self-awareness. It's tricky. Typically, it should be okay, but being culturally sensitive is key. Because, of course, as we work in this global context, we can't assume that what is acceptable, normal, comfortable in our own culture is going to translate well across different cultures. So really understanding how that might land before speaking can be an essential aspect. Respect is a word that's coming up a lot in the chat. how do we make sure that we do that respectfully would be a really key question. Another great comment about workload in particular, having a conversation about workload and making adjustments on the basis of a conversation rather than on assumptions is a great way to make sure that you stay safe from unintentionally transmitting a microaggression. Someone else is saying, I think it's okay, but these things should be discussed openly and without making assumptions and jokes. If it is coming from a place of curiosity to get to know the person better, I think that's such a great thought there. So there's a huge difference between approaching conversations with a respectful aspect and attitude of humility and curiosity, as opposed to approaching conversations with assumptions and humor. I think the ability to be curious and hold the space allows us to create that psychological safety where we can have conversations about people's personal lives in a way that feels comfortable, and that the person will know when we're giving them a compliment that it's coming from the right place and it's not going to be taken in a wrong way, which really just points to how important it is to be mindful of the words that we use in our conversations and our intention behind them. And I've just got such great comments coming in. We've got one example here, recently having received an HR complaint from a nice and friendly compliment, and the person being shocked, having used this compliment in their home country for over 20 years, and people love it. And, just really interesting to notice how things can land really differently. I think one of the things that Mark does do well is notice when Maria has a reaction to his comment. What he doesn't do well is react to it with a joke. I think often we are receiving information about how our language might be landing. And it just highlights the importance of really tuning in to what we are noticing from the person that we're having a conversation with. And when we notice something like her frown, not to be afraid to explore that and to address the fact that you might have unintentionally said something that concerns them. And we'll pick up on that in a little while. So context is everything. The goal is, of course, to include and to value all. But when we single someone out or emphasize their difference, we may unintentionally be excluding them. And we can similarly be doing that in a way that includes when we single people out. So really noticing how that might be landing. And just a top tip around personal lives. If people don't offer to talk about their personal lives, then they may not be open to being asked. One of the ways to really help understand whether that is something the person might be comfortable with is to share about yourself, is to be the one to open the conversation about sharing about personal life, and then notice how that lands and what the impact of that is. It's not easy. Changing a bad habit is much harder than starting a new habit. Changing an accidental bad habit, so often these microaggressions, as we've said, are unintentional. That's even harder. And the only way that you'll make a difference is if you want to change and commit to noticing and being mindful and taking that into account. Overcoming microaggressions is very much like giving up a bad habit like smoking, and it requires significant willpower and conscious effort. It requires us to take things that often are unconscious and make them more conscious. The end result is definitely worth it. Inclusive workplaces are better, as we saw in the video, for our mental well-being. We have more equitable relationships with co-workers. We're more content, we're more engaged, and we get more done when we feel included. And it's a worthwhile investment of energy as well as being the right thing to do. So how do we actually do this? Cultural intelligence is the set of skills and competencies that help us to navigate this complex world of diversity, in which it's so often unintentional, the impact that we have. And being intentional in our communication and inclusive in our behavior really involves 4 key elements. Start with an attitude of humility. Your assumptions about what is normal and appropriate are understandably completely valid for you, but they may not travel well. What is humorous content, as we've talked about already, for you might upset someone else. Don't be afraid of being yourself, but be aware that difference is normal. Difference is neither better nor worse, just different. And just make sure that you've got that self-awareness and other awareness. And by holding the awareness in both sides is a really important aspect of this. So being able to be conscious of how what you're saying is impacting, both on the other, but also on yourself. Knowledge, educate yourself. Take time to investigate sensitive areas for both yourself. Self-knowledge is really critical for this, as well as knowledge about others, different cultures, how things are, what the norm is in the different cultures with which you interact. Don't expect other people to tell you when you've overstepped. Be anticipating. It also may be that you're needing to educate others. You may be the one that is noticing through your awareness something that is happening in your environment. So the role of knowledge and developing skills actually goes both ways. The skill of recognizing, the skill of navigating tricky conversations, the skill of being able to share and communicate feedback to others when you notice things that might be happening that are detracting or causing someone else to not feel included. 3 aspects that, again, in a really practical way, help us bring this to life. And what the first of these is, if you ever notice that you have caused offense, or from someone's facial expressions, from their body language, from a reaction they might have, that you have unintentionally transmitted a microaggression, apologize. Far better just to come straight out and apologize. It's going to be difficult. We'll all be making mistakes. I'm sure that we're all conscious of doing that. And in fact, I'd love to hear some examples of where you might have unintentionally ended up causing a microaggression or causing someone to feel valued and recognized it. The main message here is the ability to recognize and move to action and apologize is really important. So love to hear if anyone is conscious of that. I had an experience with a colleague. I was leading a team and we had an end of year Christmas celebration planned. I thought about what would be the best celebration event to hold and decided to hold one at one of the local pubs. And later heard from one of my colleagues that she was very disappointed that it was being held in a pub. She didn't drink alcohol. She wasn't able to get there after hours. She was going to need her father to come and drop her off. And it was something that she just didn't feel comfortable about attending. And I had been oblivious to the fact that this even could be an issue. And I had actually failed to get feedback from the team beforehand about what they would like and not like in terms of the event. So that was a really big lesson for me, as something that I had intended to be really positive. Coming out and apologizing and owning that in a way that left the person feeling empowered rather than victimized is also really important. So the language you use in your apology can be critical. For example, saying, "I'm sorry, I was wrong," I made a mistake in choosing that venue is my way of owning that. Instead of saying, I'm sorry you were upset. I'm sorry you didn't like the choice that I made, puts that on the other person. So even the way we apologize can make a really big difference in the person leaving that conversation feeling empowered and with their self-esteem intact. Be active. As I mentioned, don't be passive when you or someone else uses a microaggression. Call it out, preferably in a private way and in a way that doesn't impact the person who was the victim of the microaggression. If you're able to redirect the comment, or for example, gesture as to include the other person. Not sure if you've ever been in a meeting where you notice that the person who's talking is only making eye contact with certain people in the meeting and not including others. Being able to use your body language to extend that often is all that's needed to unconsciously remind the person that there is someone else in the group that needs to be included. Redirecting in a way that includes rather than excludes, and making sure that your intervention doesn't aggravate the situation, but explicitly rules out having it happen again. And so perhaps that might be taking it offline and having a conversation later on. So we've got some great examples here about unintentionally causing a microaggression. A great one, actually, a great example that I also did recently was asking a fasting colleague to go for coffee or a meal. Laughing at a homophobic joke that without knowing that a colleague was and sensed that he wasn't comfortable and apologized. And then the person actually coming out and revealing that they were gay. I mean, I think that's a fantastic example of how in the moment recognizing and noticing, addressing it directly instead of avoiding the whole situation, and creating the kind of trust in the environment that caused the person to share something deeply personal. And I think that is a fantastic example of, how to really use the apology and the noticing and the awareness to build that trust rather than avoid it and have it never be addressed and walk away feeling uncomfortable about that. So really, really great example. We are going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes every day. It's how we deal with those that often is the real difference that we can make in the long term. Someone else talking about, I always look at hair first and make compliments if someone's changed their hair. I did that to someone with frizzy hair and she changed and said, don't do that again. Sometimes we have no idea what's going to trigger someone. Microaggressions and the receiving of them is something deeply personal. And what causes us to react may be completely different from what triggers someone else. Lots of examples with understanding differences with gender, understanding differences with age and generation. And, I constantly do this with my own teenagers, actually. I spend my life apologizing for saying the wrong thing. And then the last one of these really practical ways of doing things is using your privilege and voice to amplify others in a positive way. So especially if you're in a leadership role, you can lift others up and you can demonstrate that you value their input. Amplification emphasizes the professional qualities you value and demonstrates inclusion. Role modeling inclusivity is far more powerful than anything we could read or any course that we could attend. Amplifying it by role modeling and walking the talk is the most powerful way. Amplification emphasizes all of those things that you're wanting to see from other people. And it's not about making concessions or giving additional support, kind of moving into what we call the savior syndrome. It's looking for opportunities to give other people a voice and give them agency, and really not falling foul of assumptions and bias that take the decision away from someone. It allows people to make that choice. Things like ensuring that credit is properly assigned. If someone is interrupted, make sure you go back and hear the original speaker's thoughts. So that's an example of how we might amplify. And we have a responsibility not only to be mindful of what we might be doing, but in all of the different contexts in which we operate. So let's for a moment go back to what we explored before. And let's have a look at what Mark, the manager, could have done differently. So I would love to hear your examples of what Mark could have done differently in this same situation, welcoming a colleague he's never met back from maternity leave. We see that Mark made a mistake every step of the way, but what could he have done differently? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So, even if it's you put number one in and then put your comment, or just generally put them in around what could have been done differently in that same situation that would have amplified Maria, would have really demonstrated that connection, asked her to introduce herself, start with actually finding out a little bit more, and how is she feeling about transitioning back? Called the meeting at a very different time, say in the morning at 9 a.m., or ask when a good time would be. So we've got a lot around the time. Asking her to share what her goals are. That might really quickly have ruled out Mark's suggestion that she takes smaller clients on, if in fact he heard something very different from her around what her ambitions were. Let's have asking questions, not making so many assumptions, listening more than talking. That's a great way to be able to build connection and avoid assumptions, because the more we're able to take in about someone before we start transmitting, the more we're on the receiving end of the communication, the better we will transmit when it is our turn. Ask how she's feeling about being back. Perhaps introduce himself and share a bit about his role, demonstrate that openness. Great question there. How can I be a good manager to you? How can I support you? By asking that and being curious, he would have heard with a lot more clarity exactly what Maria needed, and made it comfortable for her to share what she might be expecting from him. So just don't go into number 3 at all. So yeah, just don't go into the question about why is your English so good. I think that's a really good piece of advice here. And another great question, if they had been keeping in touch days, if the connection had been maintained during the maternity leave, this conversation might not even have taken place in this way. So really, really good question. He could have asked about her new baby, been curious and interested, and that would have encouraged her to talk about it and set the scene for it being comfortable and possible to talk about something that's that important to you. There's also a really good comment here, which talks to the person as well on the receiving end. Maria needs to speak up as to why these microaggression comments are concerning her. So our hope is that Maria doesn't just go home overnight and decide that she's going to quit because Mark is not appearing to be a really good manager. Perhaps for her not to assume that this is not something that could be salvaged. Really along the lines of that education and knowledge and skills component that we explored before is the importance of her giving feedback to him about how these things were received from her, the ability to communicate the impact that his comments had, however unintentional they may have been. So really, really great comment there as well. Not only speak up if you see it happening to someone else, but speak up when it's impacted. And often that's how we learn. And just a really great comment. Let's see what other ones we've got here. And we've got a lot of people having experienced very, very similar. Great comment here as well is employees can train their managers to be good managers. I think a lot of my early experience as a team leader, I think I learned a lot from feedback from the people that I was managing, having made many mistakes myself. That was one of the fastest ways I learned, and the most impactful was receiving. So don't hold back on your feedback. You never know where it's going to be something that has a lasting impact on someone and brought something that was deeply unconscious to their conscious awareness, and changed how they manage others forever. So we all have a really important role to play. Great comments. So as we know, linking this direct link of microaggressions with unconscious bias, they come from the same place as unconscious bias, allowing our brains to shortcut logical processes. That's why they're so hard to combat, because of that unconscious element. It's rare for someone to deliberately put a coworker down. We're social animals. We want to have good, positive relationships. And at the heart of overcoming microaggressions is taking a personal interest in others, learning about what's important to them, and respecting and valuing their values and what makes them different. So we're going to be exploring next how these microaggressions show up, how they can show up, and in surprisingly unobvious ways, and see which of these that we can actually recognize. And so I'm going to share a quick poll with you and ask you to select any of these that you have experienced, either that you have done yourself to someone else, or that has been done unto you by someone else. And I'm hoping that you can see that poll and that's working for you. Yes, I can see answers coming in, which is great. And let's get a bit of a sense, because these microaggressions show up in surprising and sometimes unexpected ways. And we might not ever have even considered some of these to be microaggressions. But some great examples of microaggressions are things like cutting someone off mid-sentence, mispronouncing a colleague's name, not paying attention when someone's talking to you. You're on a call with someone, you have your phone up, you're answering emails. People unconsciously and often consciously can see that you're not paying attention, and the message that sends. Rolling your eyes when someone's talking. I receive that on a daily basis from some of the members in my household. Negative body language or position. Having crossed arms, looking away. That can be a real sign of resistance and not being open. In jokes or stories, very, very difficult. I remember moving to Texas from South Africa, and throughout the whole of the first month, I was on a project with a project team. I spent hours in meetings where sporting analogies were what were constantly being used to describe the progress in our project, and talking about the 40-yard line or the 20-yard line. And I was thinking, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does that mean we're ahead, we're behind? How should I be reacting? And the impact of having all of those thoughts going through my head meant that I wasn't able to contribute and was excluded from some of those. So deeply unintentional, and not having the confidence to speak up and say, I really don't understand, over and over again. It just felt like I was saying that all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. I think everyone's had a chance to enter. I'm going to end that and share the results, and let's have a look at what we've got. So the top of the list is cutting someone off mid-sentence. And we all know that we do it. And we all know how frustrating it is when it's done to us. So really noticing that urgency that one might have to get your point across, and thinking about the potential impact of that. Mispronouncing a colleague's name. I'm wondering how many of you have this experience. I'd love you to share in the chat if you are someone whose name often gets mispronounced, and whether or not it's a trigger for you. Because I think this is quite an interesting one. Some of us have a really negative reaction. For others, it's not something that's a big deal. Someone's put a great comment in here. Are these not just really bad manners? Absolutely can be seen as that. So Iveta is putting down an understanding that people, and hopefully I've pronounced your name right, but you can understand it. So for some, not a trigger. And for others, it is a trigger. But for most people, it's not a trigger. The message here is we never know if it is. We never know whether something's going to be a trigger for us. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, how we experience microaggressions is deeply personal. So we can't assume that someone is going to appreciate one in the same way that we might, or experience the impact of one in the same way that we might, which is why it's so important to be curious and to be inquiring. Reading the phone, so that's also a really, really high up one in this world where so much of our work is happening virtually. Praising one colleague's ideas, but ignoring others. So this is another really interesting one, particularly for leaders who might not realize the impact of openly and continuously acknowledging someone's performance publicly without having that be a bit more equitable. So it's, if it's always the same person that's acknowledged, that the way that might land on those who are not being acknowledged. Equally, the importance of acknowledging, and I think not taking credit, because I think taking credit for someone's work can also be experienced as a microaggression of a lack of appreciation of the effort that you might have contributed. And we've got lowing down. So what's clear to me is we've all experienced these and we've all done them. And what I would love to hear from you is, what are your triggers? What are the triggers? So we've looked at the fact that many of these are not personal triggers for you. Which are the triggers that you perceive as a microaggression? So I'd love to get some examples, and I'm just going to, I'll keep that poll up for a moment. So what really triggers you? What makes you feel devalued when someone does it intentionally or unintentionally? While you do that, I'll share an example of, in my early career, something that had a very big impact on me. I was brand new on a project, and my boss had taken me to meet our new client very early on in my career. And I was in a room full of male colleagues, much more experienced and much more senior than I was. And one of the clients knocked over his cup of coffee on the other side of the table from where I was sitting. And my boss picked up a pile of napkins and reached across the table and handed it to me and asked me to clear up the mess. And I'll never forget how that felt. He wasn't anywhere near it. I wasn't anywhere near it. And yet he passed it to me, and not anyone who was close to the mess. I remember how it really impacted my confidence, my sense of trust in him, the feeling of value that I could add. And it had a lasting impact on that relationship. I brought that up with him, and he was really surprised that I had taken it the wrong way, and that I had perceived it as really undermining in my role. So it's very interesting how different things have a different impact. So let's see some of the triggers. Having your suggestions ignored, and then suddenly someone has exactly the same one and they get acknowledged. I hear that one quite a lot, actually. Being cut off several times. Stereotypes based on nationality. people passing blame. Yeah, when you are blamed. Negative body language. Some great examples here. People multitasking when you're speaking. That's a really common one, when someone says, keep talking, I am listening, and they're off to the side doing something else. The impact that one can have, the message that sends when you do that, that's a really interesting one. Going over your head if you don't like my answer. Yeah, having your answer completely ignored. Abrupt interruptions. In jokes can be deeply exclusive. We have lots. Actions that are infantilizing, triggering, being called sweetie or being told seemingly good things like good job or look at you. So kind of that patronizing, infantilizing type thing that really can impact. Yeah, and seeing microaggressions against others can make us deeply uncomfortable. Some really, really great examples. Thank you for sharing those. So as we move towards closing, and I want to make sure that we have time to answer any questions, please do go ahead and use the Q&A function to ask questions that you might like to have answered. And while we wait for any questions to come in, would love to hear some of your thoughts. So let's see, there's a question. I'm just going to click on the answer live here. So there's been a question asked around micromanagement. So that's a really interesting one, because I think that can easily be construed. So micromanagement being having your manager hovering over your shoulder, that feeling of they are managing you in such a detailed way that it can feel to the person who's on the receiving end of that they are not trusted. And I think that's a great example of a microaggression, often really unintentional. And so I think a really important opportunity to confirm, to discuss, to set expectations, and to talk about the impact that has. What might the reason for that very close management be? What is the intention behind it? And can that intention be achieved in a different way that doesn't involve them micromanaging you? And so we've got some examples here. So if you are feeling like you're being micromanaged, really important to speak up and get curious about why that might be happening. How might you demonstrate trust to your manager in a way that allows them to manage you much more aligned with your preference? If you are someone that you think naturally micromanages, equally, I work with a lot of leaders who go, I know I'm a micromanager and I really don't know how to change that. Share that with the people that you manage. Share your tendency to micromanage. Ask them to tell you, to give you feedback when they feel like that. Explain why you sometimes find yourself compelled to do that. So take ownership for that. By making it open, you provide that opportunity to actually work through that and address that. Let's see another one. Okay, so I'm going to answer another one around how to filter microaggressions when there are multiple cultures involved. One more straightforward culture, in a more straightforward culture, it might be okay, something that a far more conservative culture might not. I think for me, the conversations around this become absolutely critical, so that you're able to educate those cultures where the approach is much more direct and straightforward around the impact on the cultures where it's not. And I think that's why often the value of a tool like Country Navigator can be so helpful, because I think so often it's unintentional. And the more we're able to equip ourselves with that knowledge, the more we're able to eliminate the chances of those type of things happening. We've also got a really interesting one. Which is a common one, actually, as we see our organizational cultures changing. How do we address microaggression if the person is someone really senior? I understand that HR is one way, but it's sometimes not effective. I think this is a great question. And I'd love to hear some thoughts in the chat, any suggestions that you have. I'll give you my take on this as well. I think often we don't address it because it is someone senior, because it is so challenging, and we're worried about repercussions. We're worried about the impact of speaking up about that. That said, I do think it's really, really important. I think, you've mentioned HR is one way. I think identifying other senior leaders who are forward-thinking and in tune can be a great way to share this and have them assist in how you might influence. Giving direct feedback to the senior leader, I think, is also something really important to consider. Some people may say that's possible. Some people may say, I can't see myself being able to do this. So there are a number of different options to approach the person directly and to talk about the impact. And I think if you are able to communicate the impact, you're often able to get through to them, to acknowledge that it might have been unintentional, completely unintentional, but to be able to share the impact on you, and then look for allies in the organization. Many companies have reporting lines. That's a great suggestion. Within the organization, people whose responsibility it is, find out who influences them and influence that person to have a conversation with them, is a really great. So you've got some really great suggestions in there as well. I'm going to just answer this one as well, and then I think this might need to be the final one as we wrap up. Do you have suggestions on ways to respond to microaggressions when you are the recipient or when you observe it happening to others? Yes, I think it's really important to, number one, acknowledge that it may have been completely unintentional. I think if people feel blamed and that you are pointing the finger at them, they get defensive and then they justify. But I think if you begin with acknowledging that what they said was most likely unintentional and that they may not be aware that it actually had a negative impact on them in this way, if you're able to share the so what with someone, they often are much more motivated to make a change. And if you talk about why you're telling them, and if you're telling them in service of the quality of the future relationship, I think that can go a really long way to influencing the person, having them remain open and not defensive, getting your point across in an empowered way, and clearly communicating what they did and why it had an impact and why it's important that you spoke to them. I think you can end up with a really positive outcome, as we are all learning. So as we end up, I really want to encourage you to share and explore the resources that are available to you in terms of this. We have clients and potential partners on this session. Those of you who already have access to Country Navigator, please go and take a look at the learning path. It will be made available to you within 24 hours on managing microaggressions. For those of you who do not have access to Country Navigator yet, please do get in touch to request a free trial. It's a fantastic way to educate yourself, and I really hope that this has been useful. In the last 30 seconds we have left, please do enter your key takeaway from the session. It's been an absolute pleasure being with you. And I hope that you have had some inspiration from this, some practical tips. And I really appreciate the sharing that you've been willing to do during this. It's been a very rich session in terms of people being willing to share their feedback and their personal experiences, and that always makes it a much more rich learning experience for everyone. So from my side, thank you so much. Enjoy exploring Country Navigator and really getting to know how you can overcome microaggressions and promote inclusivity in all of your different environments. Take care and goodbye.